Okay, we have been discussing in chapter 6. We're basically talking about Kalim. We've been talking about the vessels in Atzilus at great length. We've been discussing how they're created from the Reshimu, they're created from the remnant of the light. When God removes His infinite light in the Tzimtzum Arishan, in the original Tzimtzum, what is left over is the Reshimu. What's left over is the remnant, and from this remnant, so to speak, from this greatly contracted and much smaller light, the vessels of the world of Atzilus, of the world of emanation, are created. And we've basically been explaining the nature of these vessels. What did we explain? We basically explained that these vessels are, on the one hand, not as far away from him as the Malach Michael. They're not like the angel Michael, right? We said we compared Chesed of Atzilus, God's kindness, to the angel of Michael, who is the angel of kindness, and we said, what's the difference between the two? The angel Michael is a separate creation. He exists in the world of Bria. He has a sense of self, separate from God. He has a completely separate identity from God. He is a separate entity. God's kindness, on the other hand, is actually God's kindness. However, God's kindness is not just distant from God Himself, but distant even from His light, even from the original infinite light, which God emanated. The spheres of Atzilus, the vessels of Atzilus, are incommensurately smaller, to the extent that we say that God's wisdom and actual physical creations are equally distant from Him. That's why we say that which literally means all were made with wisdom. What this means, according to the Kabbalah, is that His wisdom is like actual physical creation to Him. It is so far from Him that it is actually at the same level. It's as if it's at the same level of the actual physical creation. So you have both. You have the fact that the spheres of Atzilus, the Kalim of Atzilus, are an expression of God, to the extent that we even call it God's wisdom. And on the other hand, they are separate from Him and incommensurate to the essence of His being. And essentially, this description and this understanding explains the nature of the vessels. And with this understanding, we can begin to go back and answer all of the questions that we had earlier in the Maimer with regards to the nature of these vessels. How can it be that God has a wisdom that is both outside of Himself, yet does not have the problems of a wisdom that's outside of Himself? In other words, why is this wisdom and this knowledge not considered to be a contradiction to God's unity, etc.? How is it possible that you have a limited thing which is able to unite with God's infinitude? Right? All of these questions are answered by understanding the nature of the vessel. So we're actually going to go and start to answer these questions here at the end of chapter 6. So I'm on page 188 in the English translation. Actually, maybe a little further. Good evening.
Doran, hey.
How's it going?
188.
Show me in there.
I made a thing here, a line. I think I made a line. No, it's over. It's 191. Here, this is where you were.
We got further. 1 second. Did we really?
This is where I made the line. I can tell you that.
Yes, okay, right. I see. Okay, we are on page 191, 3 lines in. Even though the Kalim, the vessels, are separate from God, they are nevertheless His wisdom and His understanding, and they are literally the life source. They give life to the creation, which means when we say something in Chassidus gives life, what we mean is that the essence of the creation, what makes the creation, its inner source of life. In other words, there's different types of life. Sometimes we misunderstand. Sometimes we have a very coarse understanding of what life is, right? When we say life here, usually in Chassidus, when we say life, when we say something gives life to creation, we mean what about let's take an animal, right? Let's say you have a flamingo. What about the flamingo gives the flamingo life, right? Now there's the idea that the body is vivified by its soul, which is true. It has an animal and emotive soul. The body is obviously dead when the soul is removed from it. But the thing that's most alive about the flamingo is not necessarily the soul which gives it life per se, although that's part of it. What's also alive about the flamingo is the fact that it's a flamingo. The flamingo-ness of the flamingo, right? Is its chayos. The fact that it is that it's in the form of a flamingo, that it is this type of specific thing, is actually something which as long as it doesn't decay, right? As long as the material doesn't fall apart, this thing is actually participates in that form, right? It's an idea that's sort of similar in some ways to Greek philosophy in some ways, but the idea is that you have let's say you have the same thing that when you draw a triangle on a piece of paper, and the triangle is a triangle, right? It has a certain life as a triangle. This is referred to in Chassidus and in the Kabbalah as life as well. Even though it's an inanimate object and you just draw a shape on a page, the fact that shape means something and is informed by a certain reality that's higher than it. The fact that there is an abstract reality called a triangle, right? And this thing which you draw on the paper is participating in that abstract reality, right? To some extent, this is, so to speak, called chayos. It's the inner life of the thing, not the fact that the thing is necessarily created. There's two ways that God creates something. God creates something from nothing. He makes there be something rather than nothing. But then there's also what type of thing the thing is, right? There's also what it is, the nature of that thing, right? The inner nature. This also includes the fact that a living being is alive with a soul that gives it life, like an animal is alive, like the flamingo. But it goes beyond just the soul which gives the body life, right? It goes to the very essence of what the being is. It goes to the essential flamingo-ness of the flamingo, for example. So you have in Chassidus, you have two concepts that are often referred to together. You have ur and chayas. You have light and life. It says God is our light and our life. When God is your light, the light creates something from nothing. This is basically parenthetical of everything that I'm telling you now. And the life is the inner vitality. The life is what makes you what you are. And both of these things are godly. There's the simple fact that something is, and there's the fact of what it is, right? What you could also term as metzias and mahus. There's both of these things. One is ur and one's from chayas. The chayas is the mahus. The chayas is the essence of the thing. It's what makes the thing the thing. This is the chayas. The spheres are, the vessels of Atzilus are the chayas of the creation. They're not just part of the process of create, right? It's not like, for example, we've explained before how God's wisdom is part of the process of creation, right? It's an intermediary step in the creation of the world. And we've explained it before that it's not a necessary intermediate step if God wanted to create anything, but if he wanted to create something that was objectively real, he had to have an intermediate step, because if he created something directly, the reality of that thing would be totally infused with godliness. It would be something which was part of his subjective reality. Right? That's why there's a tzimtzum, that's why there's all these things, right? So that something can at least have the perception that it's separate from God. So you have this intermediary step of knowing, we say, by God, it's God's step of knowing the thing that allows it to have an object, because if you think about it, knowing, right, as we've explained before, is the faculty of leaving oneself to attach to an objective reality outside of oneself. That's what it means to know something in the limited sense of the word know. And that's the sense that we mean when we're talking about the spheres. So God, so to speak, goes outside of his subjective reality to create an objective reality through his knowledge. And that's why God has to know something as an intermediary to creating it, right? This should all sound like review. We've spoken about this before more than once. So the fact that there's an intermediary means not just that there happens to be an intermediary. The point is not, this is what we're saying here, this is the point of Chayas, that the spheres are not an incidental intermediary. It's not like God creates the creation, He knows He happens to know the creation, so it happens to be objective, but then He just creates it as He would otherwise, right? That's not what the Kabbalah says about the spheres. What we say about the spheres and these vessels that we're talking about is that the creation is created from this knowledge. The knowledge gives internal life to the creation, right? In other words, the thing is actually created of these spheres. These spheres inform the nature. The 10 vessels inform the nature of everything in reality in an inner way. Not like creating an external reality, but these form the internal reality, the essential form, the essential being of everything that is, right? So what makes the flamingo is literally the effect of different spheres of Atzilus. It is the mixture, the admixture of all the different vessels of Atzilus through many tzimtzumim that creates such an animal as a flamingo. The inner life of the flamingo is its flamingoness. That there should even be such a thing as a flamingo, an eternal concept as a flamingo, which lives within the actual created animal, comes from the spheres. That's what we mean when we say the spheres are the life to the creation. Not that the spheres are literally the soul, so to speak, like you would think of a soul in a dead body would turn it into a living body, but rather that the spheres give they all limited defined forms in reality are directly comprised of the spheres. The spheres are the DNA of any limited defined form in the reality, whatever it be, whether it's an abstract concept or an actual physical object or a physical being or a living animal. The sphirot are the spiritual DNA of the form. You don't have a limited defined reality, even conceptually, without the spheres, and it is the spheres themselves which make up those definitions.
You're talking only about Atzilus, or are you talking about
Atzilus, and because of Atzilus, of all the other spheres as well, of every world. That's the idea. They're all nested one in the other. If you learn Kabbalah, right, all the spheres of Bria come from Malchus of Atzilus and are within Malchus of Atzilus, right, in a sense. That's what it means that the spheres are the life of the world. Chayas mamesh lenivraim, they literally give life to the creations. L'chayusa ma'ayin liyesh, to give them life from nothing into something. Meaning the being that is created, something from nothing, is defined and given defined definition and made into the creation that it is by the spheres. Like, for example, from Chesed of Atzilus, Michael, the angel Michael, is created in the world of Bria. Because Chesed of Atzilus is his kindness. Right? This is the emphasis, that it's not so separate that you would say it's a creation, God forbid. The Chesed of Atzilus is God's kindness. It is through this kindness that he gives the very substance, the very essence of kindness to Michael. In other words, where does kindness, in any creation of kindness, where does it get its kindness from? Where does that essence derive from? It derives from the Chesed of Atzilus. This is very important because the whole idea is the upshot of all of this is that things are related to God, not just by the fact that they exist, but by what they are as well. Again, things have a connection to God, not just by that they exist, but by what they are as well. In other words, there's something about the nature of Michael, which is a very abstract example, and we haven't met Michael. But my other example I was using is the flamingo, the havdil, I suppose. Right? There's something very special about. There's something innate, inherent in the nature of the flamingo that is godly. The very fact that a limited defined being exists means that definition must come from the spheres. And what are the spheres except for God's wisdom, God's kindness, God's understanding? In other words, if we could just see the connection, we would see that the definition and the essence of everything that is corresponds to the spheres, which in turn are united with God. Right? This is why you have to learn about the spheres. This is why it's important. Right? This is why I think it was the Mittler Rebbe said that anyone that has the capacity to learn about Seder Hishtalshelus, to learn about the Kabbalah of how the worlds are created, but does not learn about it, has the status of an apikeres, of like a heretic, right? Or kafir baker, right? Because the whole point is that it's if you have the capacity to understand this and you don't learn it, you're basically saying that I don't want to see God within the form of everything that is. Right? The whole point of the spheres is that the nature of literally every limited creation derives from something which is the spheres, which is in turn completely united with God. God's kindness leads to the angel Michael, which, if you go further, what comes from kindness in our world? What's one example? There's many examples if you learn the Kabbalah. But what's one example? The example the Third Rebbe famously gives is the sweet apple. The sweetness in the apple, sweetness as a taste, derives from chesed, whereas bitterness comes from gevura. So the sweetness in the apple and the angel Michael both derive a similar sort of thing in a very, very distant way. They're very removed one from the other, but it's the same sort of thing, and that sort of thing comes from the chesed of Atzilus. It's the nature of the apple. It's not just the fact that there's an apple, right? The Rambam would tell you that from the fact that an apple exists, I can prove to you that God exists, right? Chassidus would come and say, from what the apple is, I can even know God. Not just from that it is, but from what it is. That's one of the chidushim of Kabbalah. That's one of the things that Kabbalah accomplishes. Kabbalah accomplishes that we know God not just from that it is, but from what it is. Which you understand why it's so difficult to understand, because what God is obviously very, very removed from what anything else is. So it's even the spheres of Atzilus are very hard to understand. So to understand the connection to God and what something is obviously going to be a very difficult discipline. It's going to be very hard to learn and to understand. Yeah, is everyone with me, roughly?
Roughly.
And he creates Michael something from nothing. The emphasis being that the spheres are not created something from nothing, as we explained last week. The spheres are not a new creation from nothing, but rather still an emanation of God. That's why they're called Atzilus, right? We said about Matzil min HaRuach, that the language in Chumash that the word Atzilus comes from is when God takes from the Holy Spirit of Moshe and he puts it on the 70 elders, right? We said it's like a ray or an expression, right? An emanation. So Atzilus is not created something from nothing, but is rather an expression of God. V'chein b'chol ha'eser spheres, and so too in all of the 10 spheres. V'alzeh ne'emar iu v'garmu ichad. It is about the vessels of Atzilus that it says he and his garmui are chal. Garmui is translated as causations. That's a good as translation as any. He and his causes, he and his causations, what he causes are one. This refers to the vessels of Atzilus. He and those vessels are united. The vessels are not a separate creation, but are rather an expression of godliness. Shein elikus mamish, they are literally godliness. Livrei ma'ayin liyesh, they have the ability to create something from nothing, v'dai l'meivin, and this is enough for the one who understands, whoever that is. V'hinei nisbar. It is explained, and now we will explain. Yishuv Kushya Harishona de Parakeh. We will answer the question that we asked at the beginning of Parakeh. What was that? Tzemach Tzedek reminds us. How is it that the vessels are literally godliness? Yet nevertheless, in comparison to his essence, they are incommensurate, right? Which you'll remember, this is a very important question to answer, because if the vessels are not godly, then he has a knowledge which is outside of himself, like we said in the Maharal, and it's not clear how God has any relationship with the world whatsoever. Right? God is completely abstracted from the world. But if the vessels are united with him, right, and they're not be'ein arech. If he and his knowledge are at the same level and are not removed one from the other, then you have the Rambam. You have the opposite. Then you have the Rambam's teaching, which is that God is at a much lower place. God is not ultimately simple and transcendent, but rather God knowing the world is part of the definition of what God is, which is not the highest and most perfect understanding of God. that's possible, right? So you have the Rambam and the Maharal, and our answer was that if you just understand the spheres of Atzilus, and you understand the process of creating the world through the lights and the vessels, then you can understand how the Rambam and the Maharal are both right. You have the advantages of both. You have a knowledge which is united with God, but is also below God. You have something which is, you have God's knowledge is one with Him. There actually is something called God's knowledge. He is united with His knowledge of the world, which is very important if the world is to have any relationship with God. But on the other hand, you have a knowledge which does not contradict His oneness because His knowledge is at an infinite remove from Him. It is both one with Him and at an infinite remove from Him. And this is what the spheres are to, how the spheres are to be understood. So with all that we've said about the spheres and the vessels, we can now answer that question. How can it be that His knowledge is literally godliness, and yet totally removed from Him, yet at an infinite distance from His from Him Himself? V'zeh pirush loshen elokus getlich. This is what the word elokus means. What godliness means? It means getlich, godly in Yiddish. V'loi eloka ba'atzmei chas v'shalom. Godliness is not God Himself. God forbid. God forbid to say that. Pardon?
What's that mean?
It means godliness. There's something else. There's something that is not God, but rather godliness, which is not God Himself.
So it's not separated from God.
That's the point. The point is that it's not God, but it's not separated from God either. Right? There's three types of things. There's God, there's the creation, and there's something else, which is in between, which is called godliness. Godliness is not God. It's not God, but it's not a creation. It's an expression of God, is normally how we would say it.
Isn't that the similar, like the light of God?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly the idea we're talking about. Just as we speak of the powers of the soul, that the soul's thought or the soul's speech, and it's obvious that when the soul's thoughts or the soul's speech is not the soul itself, right? Clearly not. Clearly these are just emanations. These are just something that the soul can do, the way it can express itself, but not the soul itself. It is only an expression of the soul's powers, an expression of the potentials within the soul. And yet they're not separate, like Reuven is to Shimon, right? Like one person is to another. The soul's speech is clearly not as separate from my speech is not me, but it's also not as far away from me as Ronnie is. Ronnie is further away from me than my speech is. Not just physically, but qualitatively. So there's something else. There's something in between. The Ronnie in this example would be if I'm God, which is obvious, right? Ronnie is the creation, right? And the speech is something in between. It's not me, but it's not a separate creation. It's an expression, right? That's the idea. Kanal Perek Dalet, as I said before in chapter 4. V'savusan ayidei tzimtzum, and the vessels are created through the tzimtzum, through the contraction of the light, through the contraction of the light. So in other words, what is the nature of the vessels? The vessels are, by nature, the vessels are, in other words, what makes His expression, His knowledge, which is the vessels. The vessels is what makes the godly light into knowledge, into a specific being, right? God's knowledge, which is created by the vessels, is not Him, but also is not commensurate to Him. So in other words, we've, so to speak, explained by the nature of the vessels why the Sfirot, why God's knowledge is neither united with Him nor separate from Him, but is rather something in between. And this basically is the Kabbalistic answer to solve the problems of the Rambam and the Maharal as we first understood him. Basically, that's the answer. The answer to how can God, at the beginning of chapter 5, as to how can it be that the Sfiros are both godly and not, and so to speak, not godly, or godly and yet infinitely removed from God, is because the vessels are, on the one hand, an expression of Him, but on the other hand, are created through a tzimtzum, or created through a contraction. They're at a distance from God. They have a separate. They're only emanations. They're not God Himself. That's the vessels. Right? We've been talking a long time about the vessels. Now we're going to talk about the light a little bit. right? Now remember, it gets confusing because the vessels are created from the light as well, right? In a sense, vessels is a different type of light, in one sense, right? We call it vessels because it's a categorically different type. It's a categorically different type of godly expression. And the difference follows all the way down. The difference is not just at the top, but at every level it's a different expression of God. At the end of the day, however, what is the vessel? The vessel is an expression of God, right? So in other words, when we say light and we say vessels, these are both expressions of God. Right, the Reshimu, if you remember, we described the remnant, which is the source of the vessels. We described it as a light, but it's just a very, very removed light. It's a light that's an incredibly diminutive form of the original light that was there, and that's why it's called the remnant. Right, that's the vessels. The light, on the other hand, the kav, v'nei inyan kav. The kav means the ray. Right? If you remember back to our original description at the beginning of the chapter, we have God and His infinite light. The infinite light is removed to the side, which we explained a little bit what that means, that it returns back within His essence. We explained why that doesn't make a difference because God is everywhere. If you'll recall, that was a side point. But the light is returned, is pushed on the side. There's a reshimu, there's a vessel left over, and then into that, not a vessel, sorry, there's a remnant left over, a remnant of the light, and into the remnant from before, God sends from the original light, which has been moved to the side, He sends out one single ray. That single ray is the source for the light. The remnant from before is the source of the vessels. The single ray is the source of is what we call the light that's in the vessels in the spheres of Atzilus. The sphere is made up of vessel and light. So the vessel's source is in the remnant, the Reshimu, and the light that's within the sphere comes from this kav, comes from this single ray. This kav comes from the light that is above the tzimtzum, right? In other words, it comes it's not what's left over when the light is removed, but is rather a single ray drawn from that original light, which if you remember, we emphasized earlier, and I told you it was important, we emphasized earlier that it's not that the original light stops shining, it just shines somewhere else. It shines not within the place. God moves it to the side, meaning to say that it's the original light shining, but within its source, rather than outside of its source. It's the same light, and this ray comes from that light. So in other words, the ray is from Or Ein Sof, from before the Tzimtzum. It's from God's infinite light preceding the contraction. It's the same light, and this is a ray from that light. Okay?
Is that not a concentrated light, no?
Not concentrated, a single ray. A single ray is the idea.
Yeah, but you take let's say...
No, it's not every. No,
the ray goes out
no. It's not everything. We're going to explain. No, we're going to explain. It's not one. It's not everything. Yeah, we're going to explain. It's not that. It's not everything concentrated into one point. It's a single ray from all that light.
You take a big piece of paper and put it in like one little hole.
Why is that not considered?
That's not concentrated. All the other lights.
It is. We're going to explain.
It's just one.
In some sense.
I think that's what it means.
Was it a fragment of the entire light, or is
It's a ray of the light.
On one hand, you're saying there's no contraction. It's pure in its source.
No, I think of it like this. If the sun's up here, I take a big bag and put it over here, block out all the light that's coming down from the sun, except make one little hole in the piece of vapor.
Right, so that's coming from its source.
It is coming.
That's
from
the point.
source.
That's what I just said. It's the same light from the source. That's what I was trying to emphasize. It's the same light that comes from the original source. Once that light has been removed, this is brought back in, but only one ray of it. That's the idea.
But just being one ray is not, you say, is or is not a contraction?
We're going to talk about what it is. We haven't said anything about what it is yet. We went immediately to the kalim before. All we said is that there is a kav. We didn't, and then we started talking about the vessels in detail. Now we're going back and we're doing the light in detail. So we're going to explain what this is. The ray is pashut b'tachlis apshitos. It's absolutely simple. In other words, the same way that the Or Ein Sof is. Now again, this is controversial because it gets very complicated in Kabbalah with regards to the light, whether the light is simple or not. But we're going to say here that the light is absolutely simple. In other words, the light is not divided or limited in any way. This is actually an expression of that infinite light, the infinite simple expression of everything that God is, that we call the Or Ein Sof. The ray is of the same sort. It's totally simple. It's a simple ray. So then the question becomes, if it's totally simple and there's nothing there's nothing dividing it, there's nothing defining it, so then what makes it into a ray? Why do we call it a ray? A ray is obviously a metaphor, right? Why do we call it a ray? What's the idea? We're going to explain. And as far above, this ray is far above the light of the Rishimu. This is light that was untouched by the Tzimtzum. This was untouched by the contraction, as opposed to the Rishimu, the remnant, which makes the vessels that we've been talking about so far until now. We said that light is so far from the original light, it could almost be considered limited. It's not even truly infinite. This light, on the other hand, the light of the Kav, is actually infinite. It's infinite just like the original light. This ray. It's of the same quality, it's of the same nature as the original light, it's just that it's only one ray of it, okay? So on the one hand, it's way above the Rishimu, it's far closer to God, it's far closer to the original expression of the infinite light than the remnant, which goes on to make the vessels. But nevertheless, in comparison to the light and radiance of Or Ein Sof itself, the original infinite light, it's called only a ray. It's only a glimmer of that light. It is therefore a ray of a ray, right? Because this is a technical term in Chassidus. You have the ha'ara and you have the ha'ara da ha'ara. There's the ray and there's the ray of the ray, right? Because you have God. You have the infinite expression of everything that God is, which itself is only light, is only an expression, is not Him Himself. That itself is a ray, so to speak, is an expression of light. The Kav is a ray of a ray.
Twice removed, basically.
In a sense, yes. No, twice removed, basically. Yeah, well said. So it's a ray of this original ray. The Gam B'chinas Kav Levad, and it is only so in addition to being twice removed, it is also only a Kav, which he translates here as a vector, which is a very good translation. It's only a vector. It's only like in physics he means a vector, which is another word for ray, basically. It's a ray, right? A vector is a No. A vector in physics is a directional motion. Is the vector. So like velocity has a vector, right? Velocity is defined as it's
two different forces that force the
acceleration
direction.
in one. Yeah, yes. Exactly. Like finding the vector of the angle. Yeah, that's what you're thinking. That's right. That's good. You remember physics homework.
I'm surprised.
So that's what that's what a vector is. So
I don't even remember physics.
So it's a ray of a ray, and in addition, we're saying we're defining what makes it less than the infinite light. So there's a further level of remove, which we haven't discussed what if anything that means exactly. But we're also saying not only that, but it's also a ray. Now, the original Ein Sof, when we describe the original infinite light, what's it called? It also has a shape. It's not called a ray. It's called the igul. The original light is called the circle, not the ray. The infinite, God's infinite light before the Tzimtzum is usually referred to as the igul or igulin. It's the circle. This kav is called the rays, the line, right? And the reason why those two shapes are the metaphor is going to be explained presently. So this is only a line. What does that mean? Inyan akav, I'm on the last line on page 193. Inyan akav hu sheyesh le erech ve'en le reichev. What is a ray? What's a line? Or a vector? It's something that has length but no breadth, right? In other words, it's a one-dimensional object, right? It has only length. There's no a mathematical line is a one-dimensional object. It has only length. It has no width or depth, obviously, right?
It has to have width.
No, not at all. Not a physical object, a mathematical object.
Like a dot.
Theoretically, just like a dot is a no-dimensional object, right? It's just a locus. It has no size. Locus. It is. That's what it's called.
A locus?
When we say that it has only length and no breadth, this is describing a lessening of the light. This is the sense in which it's a tzimtzum, Barry. This describes a lessening. The fact that it's a ray means that it's a lessening of the light. Why? It's the breadth that is lost. In other words, the difference between the circular light, it's called a circle for other reasons as well, but the difference between the circle and the line is that the circle has breadth and the line doesn't. Right? This is the effect of the tzimtzum on the kav. What does the tzimtzum affect on the kav? That the ray, the contraction affects that the ray only has length but not breadth. Now, it may not surprise you that in Chassidus, the length, breadth, and depth are defined very extensively. In fact, the beginning of Shara Yichud, which is the famous, so to speak, extensive, almost like the Mittler Rebbe's full and orderly treatment of Chassidus. The very first chapter is about length, breadth, and depth. He's describing the difference between Chachma and Bina, because Chachma is just a point, it's just a locus, whereas Bina has all three dimensions. It has length, breadth, and depth. So these things are all very well defined in Chassidus. So what does this refer to? Bechinas ha'erech, length, meral erech meshech yeridase. Erech, length, implies the distance to which something descends. How far does the thing go? How far does it carry? That's answered by length. Think in terms of a river, right? Like that's the example used in Shara Yichud, right? In a river, the Chochmah is the wellspring and the Bina is the river in Shara Yichud. So you have the river is the length is how far it goes from the original source, which by the way immediately introduces what? It introduces higher and lower. This is another reason why Ein Sof is a circle and the Kav is a line. Because in the circle there's no higher and lower. In the circle everything is equal. It's Pashat, therefore it's a circle. There's no point in it that's closer to God or further from God. It's all the same. The Kav automatically, by having length, what length implies immediately is that there's closer to the source, further from the source. This itself is a tzimtzum. The idea that there's closer to the source and further than the source makes it less than the infinite light. This is one aspect of length, that it extends into all the four worlds. It shines in every world, commensurate to what's necessary. In other words, the light of the kav extends down into all the four worlds. In other words, everything. The kav. The point is that the length of the kav implies that it's able to be invested in all of the worlds. It comes down through all of the different levels.
So that's the eagle in Makif.
In Makif.
How many levels are there?
The point is that the eagle is naturally everywhere by Makif. That's the whole point. Right. The point is that the kav, by having the length, can come down into the worlds. The eagle, the original or Ein Sof, is everywhere, but just by nature of being a circle. The way that every point in the circle is equidistant from the center. It's naturally everywhere, so to speak. It's everywhere, but that doesn't mean it's within anything. It doesn't define the thing, right? It remains outside of it. That's part of the whole idea. Sorry, you were saying?
How many levels are there?
Of what? That the kav extends to? How many spiritual levels?
Worlds?
How many worlds are there?
7.
There's 4 spiritual worlds in the traditional definition, but the 4 spiritual worlds technically are really more like categories of worlds rather than
dimensions when you say worlds?
Yes, that is what I mean. Dimensions are types of reality, but the truth is that Chassidus explains elsewhere that within each of these types there's really infinite gradations, which in a sense means that there's an infinite number of finite things, which should theoretically be impossible. And someone wrote a letter to the Rebbe about it, and the Rebbe says God can do anything. Is the explanation for that.
There's an infinite amount of levels within each.
Yes, within each category. This is aside from the fact that if you learn some of the deeper Maimarim, it talks about how there's a higher Atzilus and a low. There's a general Atzilus and a specific Atzilus, right? And that when we talk about the 4 worlds, all 4 of them are really within the Asiya Diklalis, or in the general Asiya. It's a nested system. A lot of things in Kabbalah are nested within the worlds. The things are nested within one another. So these 4 worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya are nested within a higher level of Asiya, right? Which is part of a discussion for a different time, maybe. It's complicated. So Shemer b'chol olam ke'erkei, it shines in. So the kav shines in every world. Ke'erkei is that's a nice diuk. Like Ronnie, you could write a little diuk. The reason why the Tzemach Tzedek says ke'erkei is to distinguish it from the eagle. The reason why he says commensurate to the worlds is because the eagle also shines in every world, but not ke'erkei. Right? Or Ein Sof is everywhere, right, but not commensurate to the nature of the thing. Right? As opposed to here, it's 4 lines down on 192. to its level, according to its level, he translates it, right? That the light of the Kav doesn't just shine in every world, but shines in every world according to the nature of that world, as opposed to the original or Ein Sof, which even though technically it still shines everywhere, which is a whole other discussion that Ronnie mentioned, even though technically the original or Ein Sof still shines everywhere because the Tzimtzum is not Kipshuta, as we've explained before. The Tzimtzum is not to be taken literally, the light is never really removed, as we've explained before. Nevertheless, the way it shines everywhere is from outside. It shines everywhere, but not in a way that it's detected. It's not within the worlds. It's not it's where we are right now, but we have no way of accessing it. We're not aware of it, as opposed to the Kav, which literally creates the table. Right? That's the difference. And how does the Kav extend into all the worlds? By being invested in the vessels of Atzilus. This ray extends into all the worlds by being invested in these vessels which we've been describing. Without the vessels, this light would still be too transcendent for the limited world, because as we explained before, this light is literally still from the original or Ein Sof, the original infinite light. And the original infinite light cannot shine within the worlds. It's the worlds and limitation is inimical to its nature, therefore it has to shine in the vessels.
Did I hear you say there's a Kav within a Kav? I mean, a light within the ray within a ray?
No, this is a ray of a ray.
A ray of a ray, meaning
you have a ray, and then a ray is taken from that ray. That's the twice removed. The twice removed the idea. You have the infinite light, which is itself a ray, only an expression of God, and then an expression of that expression is the Kav. And the nature of the Kav, as we've just explained, is it is of the original infinite light, but there is a tzimtzum of sorts taking place, because rather than having erech and rechev, rather than having both extension and breadth, it has only extension. In other words, it's limited in a sense because it has higher and lower. It's given the limitation of having extension. Is basically
it's like every level it goes through, it gets watered down a bit.
Yes, it's exactly like that. Correct. Yes. The Amar she'atzmus hu pashat b'tachlis. Kamashakasav Ramak. Sorry, let me go back. I skipped a line or two. And this is the secret of how the God Himself, the essence, which really here means God's light, is invested within the vessels. This is what it means, that the light is invested within the vessels. It means that the Kav expresses itself through the vessels of Atzilus. The details, the spiritual mechanics, so to speak, is a very coarse way of putting it, but the spiritual mechanics, or the math of the Maimer, as Rabbi Shapiro and Marsdown used to say, the equations, right? How do these things fit together in the spiritual realms, of how the light and the vessel come together, is explained at much greater length elsewhere. What does it actually mean? The light and vessel come together. How do they come together? Is it just God? It seems like God just fitting these two things together in a place seems like the wrong idea, and it turns out it is the wrong idea. It's a whole thing. There's a whole process of how this works. The vessels and the light are not as separate as just because we speak of them as two categorically different things. They're not as separate as it may seem. And to tell the truth, there's probably easily 1,000 pages in Chassidus, at least, just on the spheres of Atzilus, at least 1,000 pages, explaining just the nature of what this means, that you have lights and vessels in Atzilus and things like that, to really thoroughly understand it.
Yeah. Are they formed at the same time? Lights and vessels?
There's no time. What do you mean? What's the question really?
I'm not really sure.
No, they're both equally godly. They're both equally godly, I'll tell you that. As the Ramak explains. What is the Ramak, right? Sorry? Pardon?
Answering his question. Stuff was created at different...
No, there's no time. All these things we're describing do not take place within time. They take place above time. Whatever that may mean.
Are they created in the same space?
No, it's before space also. There's no space. Space is later. Atzilus, both time and space have their source in the world of Atzilus.
So it's not like a Big Bang. Because if he did the contraction, something happened, and then contraction, and then from that you got the ray, which then...
This is prior to any physical reality.
I understand that, but I'm saying, I'm equating it in that way, because that's the way it sounds like it's happening. But the general spherical
Yeah, how do you project
broadcasting of the
something that's not
rays,
physical?
and then that got withdrawn back. So that's a change in existence.
I suppose you could see parallels there, metaphorical parallels. Yeah, sure.
And so that's sort of the sequencing. So then the Sfirot got created.
Yeah, that could be. It's a good metaphor. Anything else? Any other questions before we go on? On page 192, 2 lines from the bottom. As Rav Moshe Cordovero wrote, the famous Kabbalist upon whom we've quoted many times and upon whom much of what we're learning is based. The Ramak says that Atzmos, the essential light, is absolutely simple. It's totally pashut, it's totally simple. When we say it's absolutely simple, we mean it has nothing resembling parts, it has nothing resembling divisions, which also, as we've explained before, means that it's truly infinite, and the two things go together. Ella shenaises by tmuna al yidei hislavshas bekelim, but it gains form through being invested within vessels. It's the vessels that give it form, as we've explained before also. Sha'ara me'ira bekli chachma, the light that shines in the vessel of chachma, nase ba'tmuna pratis, the vessel gives it a certain form, liyas keach v'chayes la chachma, that it should be the power and vitality of chachma, of intellect, of knowledge, wisdom. As opposed to the light which shines in the vessel of chesed, of kindness. When it shines in the vessel of kindness, it is given the form that it should be the light and the strength and the vitality of chesed, of kindness. So in other words, it's the vessel which gives it its form. We've discussed this before. It's the vessel which defines the light. It's the same light. One light and in 10 different vessels is expressed in 10 different limited ways. And it's the vessels which give the light limited definition. Ella, rather, but shashini behem kinei be'amitas atzmusam. These changes are not acquired by the true essence of the light. In other words, the light is not made. These transformations that the light receives through going into the vessels does not affect the essence of the light. It doesn't affect the light at the deepest level. Ela kamai, rather it's like shinui hamayim bekli. It's rather like water changing in a vessel. V'shinui gavan hashemesh lefi mare ha'ashashis. And the changing of the color of the sun according to the color of the glass that it shines for, the stained glass window, right? In other words, the light remains the light that it was remained before, but it's given a form by the vessel. The water says it even more strongly, because the light that passes through a stained glass window, it's hard to imagine reversing the process, right? But water in a vessel, you can easily imagine, you pour the water into a different colored glass vessel, and now the water's a different color, right? It's easily removed. It's the same water. You remove the water from this one, and you put it in this one, and it becomes a different color, very simply. Therefore, that's why it's possible that the lights can be switched, can be exchanged. You could put the light of chesed in a vessel of gvura, as the Arizal writes. This is it's a very interesting little section here. I'm not 100% certain why it's here.
So what will happen when you put the light of chesed in gvura? Will it be gvura or chesed?
You have to read the Atzilus. You have to read the Arizal, it's an interesting little note here. I'm not 100% certain why it's here. This little bit about the vessels not really changing the light. I think it has something to do with the fact that we mustn't make the mistake that when the light shines through the vessels, the light becomes like of the vessels, right? In other words, because this is still ultimately it's the light that makes it God's wisdom. In other words, God Himself. Because the light is here as a pure and simple expression of the one simple and undivided and transcendent God, right? Even though it's within these 10 vessels. So the fact that it's the light is what makes it God's wisdom, and don't make the mistake that once the light goes into the vessel of wisdom, what you have now is something that's not godly, or that's defined only by the vessel, right? It's still light. That's the point. The point is that it's still that light. The light. Pardon?
It's like your glasses.
Yeah, exactly.
The light's coming in,
right.
But without them, it's diffused around your eye. When you go through your glasses, it concentrates in to the point that you
right, so it's the same light. It's the same light.
So that's the same.
It's the same light. It's only the vessels only make a slight, they make a change they make an important change but not an essential one, is the point. They don't change it in essence, and it's still light.
Same light going through.
The appearance, exactly. The appearance. Well said. Okay, 10 minutes left. Let's go further. To understand a little bit, the Tzemach Tzedek himself says, to understand a little bit, the idea of the investiture of the kav in the vessels, right? This is, in a sense, this is the moment we've all been waiting for, right? So we've explained the vessels, we've explained the light, and now the question is so how do these things go together, right? This is still the mystery, right? Because ultimately the vessels are limited, and ultimately the light is infinite, right? And how what's this magic trick? How do these two things interact such that they become totally united and become one, and one sphera, right? This is like the moment we've all been waiting for in chapter 6. We explain the vessels, we explain the light, but it's the unity that's the most important, because without the unity, you can explain how the wisdom is wisdom, you can explain how the light is godly, but to explain how it's godly wisdom, that's the trick, and that's the $64 million trick. How is it that the wisdom is God's wisdom? That's the trick. We understand a little bit how these two things come together, how the kav, the ray, is invested in the vessels through a metaphor, an analogy. What's the analogy? God's infinite light is called the source of pleasure. In the Ein Sof, God's infinite light is compared to pleasure, right? We have the 10 spheres, right? The 10 spheres are Chochma, Bina, and Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, and Malchus. So the 10 spheres, right? There's two higher koiches, there's two higher powers of the soul, which are referred to as keser, which are referred to the crown that goes atop the spheres. They're like spheres, but they're also not spheres. We're not really. I'm not sure if we're really dealing with them directly right now. But the two things. Sorry. The two things which are higher than the spheres are ratzon and tainug. You have desire, and you have tainug, which is pleasure. Right? A better translation for tainug, for a lot of Chassidus' purpose, rather than pleasure, is satisfaction. It's the opposite of a ratzon. A ratzon is a lack in which someone needs to go outside of themselves for whatever purpose. I need something that I am not. Right? A tainug is I am what I am, and I am so to speak in stasis. I don't need anything. I am what I am, and that is sufficient. I'm satisfied. Tainug. Pleasure is the satisfaction of desire. It's pleasure. Tainug is the idea. That's why Ein Sof is called Tainug, because Ein Sof lacks nothing.
It's quite an interesting statement.
It is, and the infinite,
the fact that we're given the ability to be satisfied at that level.
What do you mean?
It's like a higher level.
What is?
The satisfaction, or what did you use the other word?
What, the Ein Sof, God's infinite light?
The will. That's
satisfaction of desire.
Yeah.
You want a hamburger, and you have a hamburger, and then you feel pleasure, and you're happy.
Yeah. No.
Temporarily.
It's
you feel mounted because you have to be dependent on something that is outside of you.
I'm not talking about like what you tell your therapist after 80 hours. I mean, very simply.
This is Kabbalah.
This is what you tell your therapist after 80 hours is Kabbalah, Ronnie.
Yes.
You specifically, not any person. The Ein Sof is called Tainug because it has no lack. It lacks nothing, right? God's infinite light, which is the perfection of everything that both can and cannot be. It is everything that God can do and everything that God is expressed in a perfect and simple expression. It lacks nothing, and therefore it's compared to Tainug. God's infinite light is compared to satisfaction. It lacks nothing, right? It has a completeness of being within itself. Right? What could it possibly desire? Everything that is and everything that isn't is contained within it and is one with it. Right? That's why it's called pleasure, because it's totally satisfied there. What could it possibly desire? It needs nothing. Right? Is the general idea. So that's why the infinite light is called the source of all pleasure, the source of all satisfaction. Ki tainug, because pleasure, satisfaction, is the power of the soul, and which extends wider. Note the use of the word wider. We've already spoken about breadth and width in this lesson. It extends broader all of the any other power of the soul, which is visible from the many different types of pleasure. Because you have pleasures of sight and sound and smell and speech, and all the pleasures of this world, and they all derive they're from the pselas, literally from the waste of the supernal pleasure. In other words, just as we were describing before, that the sweetness of the apple comes from chesed of atzilus, so all pleasures of the world derive from the supernal tainug, right? There's a supernal pleasure, there's a supernal sense of satisfaction, and all the minor satisfactions of the world, which as Ronnie was pointing out in his Freudian observations, all pleasures of this world are obviously imperfect, right? Because it has to do with the fact that they're embodied in matter, right? That's the classic philosophical explanation. The Chassidic explanation is that they're distant from God and they conceal godliness. But the bottom line is that all pleasures of this world are limited and imperfect, right? But nevertheless, where do all these imperfect things come from? They all have their source in the source of pleasure, which is God, which is Ein Sof, which is God's infinitude. Shenafal b'shviras hakelim, and these are what fell in the breaking of the vessels. I'm not going to talk about. I don't have 5 minutes is not sufficient, so we're not going to talk about what the breaking of the vessels is. Suffice it to say that it's the process of the creation of the world allows different aspects of the spiritual to dwell within the physical. In other words, there's long story short, the Arizal was the progenitor of a liberation movement. The Arizal believed in liberation theology, right? In what sense? In the sense that he believed in liberation theology, because basically what he said is that the entire purpose of creation is to free all of the things which fell from the spiritual worlds into our world and return them to their source. So in other words, the Arizal would say the hamburger has a very imperfect and slight form of pleasure, but the point is that if you use it for its godly source, this is called making a yichud, making a unity, and you can return it and reconnect it with its godly source. You can reconnect the pleasure of the physical object with its source in God's infinite light, and once all of these sparks, they're called sparks, are misbarer, are refined and freed from their imprisonment within the physical creation, that is what is meant by the coming of Mashiach. This is the Kabbalistic concept of tikkun olam, which has nothing to do with saving the whales.
Or the trees.
And these pleasures of the world, we're not going to get much further, so we're going to have half an analogy now, but it's okay. We have these pleasures of the world are totally incommensurate. They're infinitely removed from the pleasure even in the lower Gan Eden. In Chassidus and Kabbalah, we have a lower Gan Eden and a higher Gan Eden, right? The pleasure of Gan Eden, of both the lower and the higher, has to do with taking pleasure in God. This is, by the way, not even a Kabbalistic opinion. This is even what the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim, is that the pleasure of Gan Eden is the pleasure of enjoying God, basking in the rays of godliness, as you would say in Kabbalah, or as the Rambam would say, conceiving of God, knowing God at an intellectual level is the pleasure of Gan Eden. It's the pleasure of the world to come. So all the pleasures of this world are nothing compared to even the pleasure of the lower Gan Eden, which the lower Gan Eden is located within the spiritual world, the fourth spiritual world, in other words, which itself is obviously very removed from Ein Sof, from God's infinite light. So the lower Gan Eden, even the lower Gan Eden is so much closer to the true pleasure that you can perceive God, you have access to God's light there, even in a very contracted and limited way. So that pleasure is much higher than the pleasure of the world, in which the godly pleasure is enclosed within physical things. So the pleasure of the lower Gan Eden is much higher than any of the pleasures of this world. This is written elsewhere. According to what the sages say, mutav delidaine chulu.
What's delidaine?
The sages say it is preferable that he be judged than enter the world to come. Right? In other words, this has to do with, if you read the footnote here, it's from the story of Acher. I'll read it to you quickly. Acher was a great scholar, but had committed many severe transgressions. He is the prototypical bad boy, prototypical rebel of Judaism in the Talmud. After he was a great sage, but he sinned and he denied God, etc. Hence, after his death, a heavenly voice declared that rather than undergo the harsh punishments of Gehenna necessary to purify himself before he could receive a portion of the world to come, it would be preferable for him to forgo both the punishments and that eternal reward. Right? In other words, it was suggested at a spiritual level, a heavenly voice came out, it suggested maybe he should take not Gehenna and not Gan Eden. Maybe that would be better for him, because his Gehenna was going to be so severe, his punishment and his cleansing process was going to be so severe, it was said maybe he should forgo both. Rabbi Meir, his colleague and student, however, maintained it was preferable for him to be judged so that he would ultimately receive these pleasures. Rabbi Meir said that even the lower Gan Eden and the pleasures of the lower Gan Eden were so great that he should withstand all of that punishment in order to accomplish that great pleasure. In other words, this is a source in the Gemara about how great are the pleasures of Gan Eden. Chassidus explains that from Rabbi Meir's words it can be inferred the pleasures of even the lower Gan Eden are so great it is worth undergoing all of the suffering in Gehenna to receive them. And there are many. We're really doing half an analogy here. I'll at least finish the sentence. There are many levels and many ascents, infinite levels. This is here some of the infinite levels I was talking about before. The infinite levels with regards to pleasures. There's infinite levels of pleasure, one after the other, and you constantly ascend to higher ones in Gan Eden. Meaning, it says that Talmidei Chachamim have no rest in this world and no rest in the world to come. Right? They have no rest in this world because they're troubled and they have all these things which interrupt their Torah study. And in the world to come, they have no rest because they're constantly moving from one level to the next. They're constantly ascending higher and higher. Right? There's no limit to it. There's infinite room to ascend closer to God. It's an asymptotic ascent. We had a very mathematical class tonight. The source of all pleasure is the infinite, God's infinite light, may it be blessed. Meaning his light and not he himself, God forbid, not God himself. The source of pleasure is rather his infinite light. And this ray of pleasure invests itself in everything mentioned above, in all of the powers mentioned above. Shehema Eser Sfiras Chochma Bina, which are the 10 spheres which begin with Chochma and Bina, and enhances them and gives them life. We're already over time, 1 second. Okay, we'll finish our half of the analogy here. Kamashal ba'adam, just like in a person, that commensurate to the pleasure that a person has in intellect, kach yitosef sichle lechadesh. So too, his sichle lechadesh. I think his ability to innovate is enhanced. In other words, it's. Pleasure drives everything else. Pleasure and will are the two drive. That's why they're not really considered spheres themselves, because they're more general than spheres. They precede the other abilities of the soul, and the reason why they precede them, one of the reasons why they precede them, is because they drive them. Everything is driven by will and pleasure. So the idea is that the pleasure is invested at every level, just like in a person. If a person takes pleasure in learning, right, that drives their further learning. It creates more of their intellect, their ability to be mechadesh, their ability to innovate and come up with new ideas. In other words, they grow seichel. The type of person that grows intellect and that makes intellect broader and adds to intellect, the growth of intellect comes about through pleasure. It's the type of person that enjoys it that makes it grow more. And it's just pointing out that throughout all of the world, it's the pleasure that's in the driver's seat. It's the pleasure that drives everything. It's the driving force behind all these things. There's ratzon also, but that's a separate discussion. The pleasure drives everything. So a person who enjoys enjoys ideas will generally be the person that comes up with new ideas and extends intellect and makes new things, new discoveries, new chidushim in Torah, things like that. This is all part of the analogy, which we'll have to repeat next week because everyone's going to forget it by then, including me.
Thank you.